did a bunch of architecture classes. I love architecture. I didn't get very far because it was terrible math, but that informed a lot of my skills later, and always trying to do something that was architecturally related, or just, I love architecture. And again, stepping back to the commercial I was doing for A Christmas Carol for American Conservatory Theater, I was fascinated with their theater building, because it was beautiful, it was old, it was even before Art Deco, it was just gorgeous. So when thinking about creating a commercial for their Christmas Carol show, I was like, oh, well, why don't we do something with the theater? Because it's such a cool building, we can shoot it or something. And there's strict union restrictions around working in the actual theater. So it's just, Hollywood and acting and all that. There are strict union rules and areas that you can abide by and work within, but there are strict union regulations that they followed, and they had a union there that the artists, the actors, and the stage people were part of. So I couldn't actually do anything in the theater, which was really disappointing. I was like, I want to shoot the theater. I can't shoot the theater because we need approval from the union, and that's probably not going to happen. So I took it upon myself to just take photos of, which were acceptable, photos of the theater, and repurpose that and create digitally in the computer in After Effects, basically build the facade out of photos of the front of the theater. Because I had this idea of like we're in the sky and we pull down and sweep past the theater. It's beautiful, all this beautiful architectural details, and then fly through the doors and we get to the stage, and the curtains open, and then there's Christmas Carol playing. So I did that. But I look back at it, I was not using 3D software. This is all in like After Effects, and in After Effects you can't really do true 3D. It's more planes and surfaces. Yeah. But it looked pretty convincing. It looked pretty good, and for that era and that time period that I was working, I was like, okay, that's pretty impressive. So I did it. It was great. Got an amazing response, and we were just asked if we wanted to submit it for Emmy consideration, and we did it. And there was a lot of money. It's expensive to submit things to the Emmys and those types of organizations because they do make money off of that. We submitted it, and 6 months later, went to the big ceremony. Again, this was a regional technical Emmy event, and the Emmy Awards they were giving were regional technical Emmys. Mm-hmm. But it was still a big event. It was like at a big hotel, fancy hotel in San Francisco. We went. It was like at the fancy Hilton, and we won. I remember we were the last category, and I was near panic attack when they got to it. I was like, oh my God, what's going to happen? And they said our names, and it was just like, it's nerve-wracking. But I was like, okay, if we win, I had a little written piece that I put in my pocket. I was like, okay, just in case. But probably the chances of that happening are probably not that high. Yeah. But we won. Ran up on stage, and I was the main. I directed it, I created it, I spoke, and I just remember vaguely, I did it, and I was like, okay, keeping the anxiety in check, because I don't want to freak out on stage, and just hundreds of people staring at me. But it was like the lights are so bright. I think that's done intentionally, that it almost blurs everybody. But anyways, it was a thing, and it was exciting. And
it must have been so surreal, you being there with other producers as well and other people. It must have been amazing when you went up there. And
it was pretty. It was thank you. It was a pretty once in a lifetime experience.
Yes.
And pretty exciting and very surreal. It was like a dream. Even being up there, it's like everything's kind of blurry, and the anxiety kind of sweeps away because now you're on stage.
Yeah, you have to say something.
Yes, and now I have to say something, and it's like all the anxiety just sweeps away, and you're it's blurred and it's surreal. And it's so funny too when you get the Emmys on stage. Just remember this: the Emmys they get on stage are not the Emmys that they take home with. That's just a dummy they're getting. The Emmy is just a blank. What they do is they cart you in the back, and then they give you your official Emmy. So every Emmy that everybody is holding on stage, probably the Oscars too, is a blank. Because also, if anything happens on stage or whatever, it's covered. You get your Emmy in the back. And that's where usually the bigger Emmy events, the national ones, and the Oscars, Usually when they do that, after you pick up your actual statue, then you get to face the crowd and what is it, the media and the all the paparazzi. So when you see them out talking with the background, the step and repeat behind them, it's usually after they've picked up their statue.
With that said, I'm wondering, from the Emmys to, how did you go from winning your award to opening up this store in Mighty Luchador?
It's like 14 years in between. After the Emmy, I was still working at KTVU, the TV station there, and doing freelance work. But I was getting really, really restless. Okay, I'd won this Emmy, and internally I was like, I need to keep pushing. Like, I want to do amazing, cooler, big work. I want to do big commercial work. I want to work in the industry.
Was the pressure, like, at a certain point too much for you after winning the award, or was it easy to manage?
I'm trying to think back. I mean, I had a lot of aspirations, and it was like, oh, well, if I can win this, I can do anything, right?
Because I think after you win an award, especially, I feel like a lot of people go through that stage where it's like, you need to be, like, top quality, and then it, like, eventually gets them, and then something happens. So,
well, I would say, yeah, if not outright, I was certainly feeling, though, that I was feeling that, just restless and wanting to see where I could push, and that I was capable of more, and wanting to do more, wanting to do higher quality work. I mean, yes, I like some of the work I did for, I like some of the work I did for the mini dealership and so forth. But these were small local companies. Like, I want to go mainstream. I don't want to work for a big director, and I want to do big stuff, big film, big commercial. So I just packed up my bags. I quit my job at KTVU. Quit, stuffed everything I had, including that Emmy, and I certainly held on to that Emmy pretty closely. It's like this big blue box. In my little Mini Cooper, because I owned a Mini Cooper, and drove down here with nothing lined up. I had maybe a couple, I wouldn't even call them interviews, like meeting with some people in the industry and in a couple agencies here in LA, but I had no work lined up. And I had like $5,000 in pocket, and I was like, okay, I can make this work. It was rough.
So you really took your chance with...
I did. I really did. Really took my chance. It was like, I don't know where this is going to end, and I don't know what's going to happen, and I don't know if I'm going to make it, but, and at that point, I won the Emmy, so it was like, anything's possible, come on. Coming here, I lived in a motel. I lived in a motel for like a week, which is horrible, with my Mini Cooper packed with stuff, it was always like nerve-wracking, like, is anybody going to break into my Mini Cooper? Including my Emmy. That said, I eventually found a place to live and settled. I got settled here in LA, and I had those little meetings with a couple agencies here in LA. One of them was a well-known title company. Got a great tour of the facilities. It's still around, Imaginary Forces. And another company called Murata, which at the time was a visual effects agency that was run. It was a visual effects agency that was run by Guillermo del Toro, and everybody was very excited about it because they were doing cool stuff. I was like, I want to work for them. Met with the director there. I showed him my portfolio. I told him I had won an Emmy. He saw my work. I showed him my work, and he said, "This is shit." Oh, pardon.
No.
Oh my God, I'm swearing. This is beep. This is beep work. I need to see better out of you. You need to commit a whole month, learn 3D, and just commit a whole month to doing work. At the time, I was like, what is this guy talking about? Like, screw you. Like, I have to make a living. I have to survive. I have rent to pay now. Like, I can't just put everything aside. And still to this day, it does kind of bother me. I will not mention the director's name. He's still out there. And he had won a couple Grammys himself. That said, I eventually continued doing little projects. I directed a commercial in San Francisco, but I was living here in LA now. And then an agency called Syndrome Studio got in touch. They liked my work. They saw the potential. And yes, in hindsight, looking back, it's like, okay, maybe some of my stuff was simple After Effects stuff and could have been pushed further. Eventually, I did push further. That just drove me harder. I was like, okay, I'm going to do even harder, so eventually I can work in Murata. Eventually, Murata went under. So, woo. But that's it. Syndrome Studio hired me, and I got my first job in the industry, and that was great. I started doing concert graphics for different music artists. I did music graphics and concert graphics for Kelly Clarkson. God, we did stuff for Demi Lovato. At some point, I was flown out by the agency Syndrome Studio to Spain to work with Shakira. I art directed the motion graphics for Shakira's international concert tour in 2018 also. So I was in Spain. I didn't work directly with Shakira, but she was like over there.
What was that like, just doing all that work? It's like, how different was it from doing work in San Francisco?
Well, this was like, the expectations are a lot higher. Budgets are bigger, and just the demand is a lot more on your shoulders. So there's a lot more to do, and the expectation to do better work, higher quality work, was 10 times more. And this was like crazy. We'd been working on it prior for about a few months, and then we flew out to Barcelona. I'd flown out to Barcelona because that's where she lived, and that's where she had set up her tour and her whole stage setup there in Barcelona, so she could do rehearsals there. Flew out, and it was just an insane 3 weeks, 2-3 weeks. That just I saw Barcelona only through the windows of the taxi, getting from the hotel to the auditorium where it was all set up. I did not visit Spain whatsoever. I regret that. It's a beautiful city, I hear. I was working that entire time. It was like we'd get there at 8 a.m. and we'd stay until midnight every single day. There was no break in between. The industry can be really hard.
For 2-3 weeks.
Yes.
And was that your first time out of country, or when did you visit Mexico?
Yes. Well, Mexico, step back. That's going back in time. So I know we're going to the career path, and that was Mexico. I would go often as a kid with my family, because I have a lot of family in Mexico, both in Guadalajara and in a small town outside of Guadalajara called Huchapila, which is actually named after the flower god, Xochipilli. Xochipilli is the god name, so that town is named after that god. Xochipila, or Xochipilli is the god, Huchapila is the town, but it's named after that god, the god of flowers, and a lot of different things. You can look it up. So we would go there to visit family, and small little town, small little Mexican town, a little square, but it's beautiful, like these big adobe homes and buildings that have been there for like centuries. In fact, where my dad's sister lived, which is we'd stay with her, was this giant building, and it had a dome. It had a big dome where bats would go up and stay in the top part of the dome. It was like ancient, and it was all adobe and ancient. In fact, when they were extending part of the building to put a kitchen in there, they'd found skeletons underground there. It was just skeletons, yes. They were like dead bodies underneath, and probably more than they found. It always creeped me out, but it was amazing and beautiful. So we'd go there, we'd stay there, and there'd be different fairs that would come through, and different shows, like lucha shows that would be there. And so that was kind of my first exposure to Lucha Libre, was watching shows, lucha shows there in the town that would be just floating through, that we'd go just in an afternoon to go check out. And it was amazing, but it was always like, who are these crazy guys? They're just wearing little underwear and they're jumping all over, but it would be amazing. Like, they're like superheroes. They had capes, they had masks. There was the Rudos and the Technicos, the good guys and the bad guys.
I mean, I think any child would find that interesting to watch, and they would artisticate for that.
Right, it was crazy. I didn't understand it. What the hell is this? But it's pretty cool as a kid. It's all the theatrics of it and the mask and so forth. So that was my first exposure to it. And we did go to quite a few whenever we go to Mexico. So that was always living in the back of my head and sort of part of my childhood going into adulthood.
And for comparing Mexico to Spain, I know you didn't see much of it, but how how different was it from Mexico? Did you...
or was it even compatible considering how hard you were working?
I mean, I really didn't see the city. We saw our hotel. I'd have breakfast, 8 a.m., got to get to the auditorium. I mean, I saw a lot of stuff through the taxi. The first day we arrived, we did have a little bit of time to just explore a little bit, but it is a different place. But there are like carryovers. I can see
Yeah.
similarities.
Some like the Spanish culture that
Exactly.
carried over.
Exactly.
Go.
But yes.
Go ahead. I thought you had a question.
No, that was,
Actually, based on what watching those luchadores in
Yes.
Mexico, when did you? I'm actually just interested. When did you decide to make your shop? How did this come to be after all your work you've done, from San Francisco to Los Angeles
I know,
to
right?
Barcelona?
A lot of jumping.
You've
So I'll step back a little. So before Shakira in Barcelona, I've been working at Syndrome, and then I was working in other agencies and companies around town. Just different visual effects agencies. I worked for Apple, Beats by Dre. I worked for Warner Brothers. I worked for a lot of different companies around town. It was just part of like I was a freelancer, and I would just go wherever there was work, and a lot of it were with these small agencies as well as big companies. One company I worked for was Brand New School, which is still around, and they do a lot of big high-profile commercials, usually animation-based. And it's ironic too because that director Murata, who I talked with, who totally shot me down. He'd recommended working for Brand New School, so eventually I did work for Brand New School, yeah, I started working there, and we're working on tons of commercials. But it's advertising, so it's a lot of brutal hours and late nights, and like the expectation, like you can't leave your desk. Like this was before remote culture, so like we're there working in a big long table, a bunch of artists, late into the evening, to try and meet deadlines and meet notes and do work. And I was working on, there was a lot of crazy commercials that I was working on, but one specific commercial that really killed me was a chorus commercial. And that was it was the simplest thing, and it had been pre-shot by another director. I liked the director, he was a great guy, but it was just mostly filmed in bars and so forth, and had this angling approach where each shot was like moving like left to right, each shot in like a bar and someone's backyard where they're all drinking Coors and stuff, and I was doing additional graphics over like text and stuff for that commercial, but it was just killer. It was just killing me. I'd get home at like 1 a.m, and I just told myself, I'm spending so much time committed on these projects and commercials and killing myself and dedicating all my creative ability directed at these commercials for another client who's not me. I was like, I need to do something for myself that can be fulfilling, and maybe I can make some money out of it, but at least it's me and can speak to who I am and represent me, and maybe I can make some money off of it. So it was one night. I'd just come home so late. It was my little tiny apartment, and I was like, I can't keep doing this. And I was like, all right, the Luchadors. Another inspiration with that was, at that same agency was another creative director, and at that time I was like regular basic animator. I was not higher on the levels just yet. I was just a basic animator. But there was a creative director I really liked. He was really great, and he was doing his own thing, which was this fractal animation thing, and he went by the name Hexiosis, and he started to have a giant following on social media at that time, and that was like early social media. Like he had like thousands of followers, and he was doing these really cool animation, geometric inspired animations, or it's sort of pushing through, kind of like a screensaver, but they're really hypnotic and really colorful and pretty. And he was giving stickers and selling posters and with his logo and the art from the animations he was doing. So it inspired me. He was also a really nice guy. He still kind of does it on the side. If you look up Hexiosis, you can find him on social media still. He does it, but not as much as he did, say 5 to 10 years ago. But I saw him and I was like, okay, that's inspiring. He's doing his own thing. That's all him. He's creating merch and he's selling things. I was like, I want to do something like that. So, and then again, I was like, well, what do I have to offer that can be my own thing and speak to me and be fulfilling and maybe make some money off of? And I was like, oh, the Luchador thing, right. And I'd also been working on superhero stuff on side of that and outside like different clients. I was like, oh, we have our own like Mexican Latino superheroes, the Luchadors. Like those, they're awesome. They have their own mythology. They have their own story. There's the good guys and the bad guys. So that was brewing in my head. So I started exploring that. It was like I had a name in my mind, like the Mighty Luchador. I was like, oh, that's cool. I got to do something with that. But I had no money, and I was still working a whole lot. After that, I went to a Lucha Vaboom show. So this was these ideas were percolating in my head. Someone introduced me to and invited me to a Lucha Vaboom show. I went to it. This was 2015, and it was amazing. It was like Lucha Vaboom is the big luchador lucha show here in town, and they have a couple shows. They still do it, and it's pretty incredible. Some awesome shows and awesome fights and matches there, and some really well-known luchadors come out to perform. So I went out, and Cassandro, I'm not sure if you've heard of Cassandro.
Yeah, no,
He's Cassandro is a luchador, but he's a maskless luchador. He goes by. There's a certain term that he goes by that speaks to the type of luchador he is, and I'm blanking on it right now. It will come to me. It's on the tip of my tongue. But Cassandro is amazing. They just came out with an Amazon movie the last year or so that talks a little about his life and his adventures and his exposure and his notoriety and the controversy around him. And he was performing, and that was amazing. Like, he went on stage. Well, excuse me, I step back. He came out, and there was a fight with him, and then the last part of his fight, he sort of disappeared, and I was there. I wasn't next to the stage. I was a bit away from the stage because you had to buy more expensive tickets to sit by the stage. But he'd gone to the second floor because there's multiple floors, and we're like, what happened to Cassandro? Where is he? And the fight was great, and suddenly he leaps off the second floor of there in the theater down into the crowd. Into the crowd. And I was like, oh my God. And just everybody got up, and what happened? He just flew into the crowd. Like, what? It was amazing. Like, it was just that moment of like, wow, this guy really just jumped off the balcony and dived into the crowd. Like, didn't see it coming, and it was crazy. Everybody just kind of ran up there close by him and surrounded him, so you couldn't see what happened. He got up and raised his hands, and everybody clapped. It was amazing. It was just the excitement of it, because it was totally not scripted, and it was amazing. And I know there's a lot of people who talk about this specific show. I can say I was there, but that was inspiring too. So I had this idea of this lucha thing. I was like, oh, and seeing that just inspired me further. There was a documentary also about Cassandro that came out about 5 years ago, and that talks about apparently when he jumped off the second floor balcony, he broke his leg. So when he stood up, he was in horrible pain, and apparently that affected him later on, which is kind of sad. It's horrible. But it was a great show, and again, just pushed the idea further. So I started sketching and designing, and I was like, okay, I can use my storytelling skills to come up with the characters, and I was inspired by him. I was inspired by the original luchador, El Santo.
Is there any character in specific that is inspired by Cassandro? In particular?
Yeah, well, El Santo, definitely. Blue Demon, the original guys, 60s and 70s, there are movies around them. Mil Máscaras is amazing. La Parca, I love La Parca. He's this skull mask. He's pretty amazing. There's just some iconic luchadors. El Solitario, I believe. He has a gold mask. There's just the different characters and the different mythologies in lucha culture and luchadors are just fantastic, and there's so much to take from. Originally, my idea was going to be somehow repurposing or doing like my own El Santo, El Santo, something based like how can I take El Santo and use his image or whatever, but I would figure like there's probably licensing or whatever, and he is very militant about his licensing and all that, including his son. So I was like, oh, I can come up with my own characters based off the mythology of all these different luchadors. How can I sort of mash it together and come up with my own, inspired by their stories, but my own original characters? And that's where the cast of characters. Almighty was going to be like I mean, it's kind of the brand is named after him. He was going to be the main hero, and he kind of is my second comic book. Then we had the bad guy, Sinestro, Sinister in Spanish, and I started just creating this story in the back of my head. What are the motivations for these characters? Where did they come from? How did they become a luchador? What is the driving motivation for them? I was always fascinated too with like, you know, what does a luchador do in his day-to-day life? Like, is it family? Does he always wear a mask? You know, what happens behind the mask? And not necessarily taking off the mask, but what is happening in his life beyond the mask. I was always fascinated by that. So that kind of informed it, but I wanted to be kid-friendly and be general and accessible for all audiences, and so I kind of geared it more towards kids. And I was inspired by the Dunnies and Moneys, these little guys with big heads, and I was like, okay, that's popular in the market. How can I do a play off of that?
How many drafts were there for each character? Like, how many attempts did it take you to like create this final form of?
But also on top of that, can you take us through, you know, your design choices for some of these characters, but also just like the thought process behind each of your main characters for the Mighty Luchador, and why, you know, maybe why some of their history, why, you know, just the choices you made behind those.
I mean, I wanted my superhero, my main hero that I named after the brand, Almighty. Then I wanted, you know, his partner, someone who was kind of funny and wacky and silly, that could be sort of a contrast to him. I feel like Almighty, the character, was very clean cut, kind of naive in his own way, kind of like a Superman kind of character. How could I introduce, like, a good comparison would be like a Deadpool kind of character that could be his sidekick. And that's where the idea of Senor Fuego came about. And Almighty was going to be very much based off, and you can see in the design for him, it is Day of the Dead inspired, as well as very inspired by El Santo and his look and his mask. But with a little play like the star eyes, I thought that was unique. And I also wanted to give them all a unique look that was something different that I hadn't seen. How can I take those features of a human being in the luchador and exaggerate in a way? And also the idea of, like, what if, like, their mask became just their full persona and just became them completely. So that was an idea. And then Sinestro was like, I was inspired by a lot of Japanese art and just wanted something that was Japanese inspired, as well as inspired like La Parka, and he has a skull like mask. And like, how could I take that and create something that's interesting and cool and kind of scary in a way? So that definitely informed that.
So Sinestro is a Mexican-Japanese fusion, so to speak.
Well, the design of him is. In the story of the character, he's sort of a luchador that didn't want to be a rudo. He always played the rudo. He always played the bad guy and didn't want to be the bad guy. And the gods took it upon themselves to take him and use him as a villain. And against his wishes, it was sort of like, okay, it's sort of like a Darth Vader kind of thing. I'm pulling from a lot of Star Wars and that sort of a mythology there. So he's sort of the reluctant bad guy villain. So that's sort of his background. Almighty is sort of the reluctant superhero himself. He didn't want to be a superhero, but he had a well-known career, and now he's been put and thrown into a position of leadership, I guess, and leading people, and still new territory for him. And then Senor Fuego is sort of, you know, jolly, fun, sort of, he has a cigar, or maybe it's something else. Is sort of more laid back and sort of more carefree, but very supportive. But you know, you don't want to piss off Senor Fuego. He's fiery. And over the course of how the characters have evolved, is Senor Fuego. He's just the mustache, the little cigar, the again calling back to my '80s upbringing. He's got the little Thriller jacket. I love Thriller. Michael Jackson, my '80s upbringing has informed that jacket and went with him so well. That he's kind of taken the spotlight and taken lead. So he's become kind of the main character now, just due to the response and his design and so forth. But Almighty's involved in there, but really it is the Senor Fuego show now.
So for Senor Fuego, I was reading on your website, he's Scottish.
He's supposed to be...
Why? Just get a curiosity.
Scottish. Well, also... the same era of lucha libre and films, lucha films with El Santo and Blue Demon, 60s going into the 70s, and they're kind of kitsch. I also grew up with Star Trek. Love Star Trek. Same kind of dynamics, a family dynamic, characters that will wear outlandish costumes. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Okay. Characters that wear outlandish costumes and aliens in their case. I love the character of Scotty. He was always like the carefree, funny, silly, rambunctious engineer that was the miracle worker, but it always got things done. He always came through, but he always loved his scotch and some alcohol. But he was a carefree, likable guy that was sort of your average guy, your average Joe. He's Scottish, loved the accent. There's a certain humor around that, and I know Scotty from Star Trek has been parodied a lot. There's just something really endearing about him and that character that I felt I could translate into this character of Senor Fuego. But he's supposed to be, I have revised the mythology with Senor Fuego. He's still meant to be like a Scottish sailor, but he's half Mexican.
Okay.
Senor Fuego is half Mexican and half Scottish, and sort of comes from a background of sailing, and kind of started out as a sailor and then worked his way to being a luchador.